Quorum being present, I'll call this meeting of the Transportation Policy Board for the El Paso Metropolitan Planning Organization to order. Can you join me, rise to the Pledge of Allegiance. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Thank you. So we'll begin with open comment period.
We do have open comment from Mr. Mike Rooney and then Mr.
Not yet.
Okay. We have Mr. Juanito Iberg.
Mr. Iberg?
Buenos dias, good morning all. My name is John Iberg, aka Juanito Iberg, aka Biker John. I am an expert bicyclist, both touring and commuting. 38 years ago, San Diego, California was my home port, back before this shrank. When I wasn't at sea, I was with the world-class Knickerbockers of San Diego, California. What we were working on was the League of American Women, the LAW National Bicycle Rally in San Diego. Took a lot of timing, a lot of processing, a lot of contact, and involvement with others. The Knickerbockers sponsored the LAW National Rally called Coastline 79 in conjunction with San Diego State University, Caltrans, the San Diego EPMPO. And you're wondering, well, why is he here talking to us about that? Because when LAW upgraded to become League of American Bicyclists, LAB, they became more an advocacy group in Washington, D.C. And they didn't put so much emphasis on having national rallies. It's time for us to put El Paso on the map. I would like us, and it's going to involve you for sure, for us to have Boundary 23. You say, well, that's a far way away. It takes a while to plan these things out. Back then, there were hundreds, maybe thousands, of people who bicycled in for that rally, Coastline 79. Boundary 23, we can bring thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people here to bicycle. It's going to take coordination and cooperation with everybody. And I really appreciate your being here. And we will be in more contact as we work on this. Does anybody have any questions?
Any questions? Thank you, sir.
Thank you all very, very much. Keep up the good work.
Appreciate it.
And then we have Hilda Villegas, but for item number 4.
Okay. So we'll wait till then. All right. Move to item number 1.
Item number 1 is discussion and action to approve the minutes for the November 17 Transportation Policy Board meeting.
Representative No, do you have a second?
I'm sorry, who was the first?
Representative No.
And the
I have a
second?
Second from Mayor Perea. All those in favor?
Aye.
All any opposed? Any abstaining? Motion carries.
Item number 2 is discussion and action to approve recommendations from the Transportation Project Advisory Committee to approve the proposed project list for the fiscal year 2018 Transportation Alternatives Program, TAP Set Aside Project Call.
Yes, sir.
Good morning, Greg McNichol with Chairman of TPAC. I just wanted, this item is just to remind everybody, we had a call for TAP projects. It was in late summer, early fall. Several projects were put together, submitted. To get the exact number you've got in front of you, 14 or so. We did appoint an ad hoc committee to review and score these. They were all New Mexico, from people from New Mexico, so they weren't involved or had a project for consideration. And this is the scoring that they presented to us at our meeting in early December, and we ratified and presenting to y'all for ratification.
Okay. Are there any questions, members? Do I have a motion?
Make a motion to approve.
I have Mayor? Okay, so we have a motion to approve, is second?
Second.
Second, Walter Miller. All those in favor? Any opposed? Any abstaining? Motion carries.
Item number 3 is discussion action to approve recommendations from the Transportation Project Advisory Committee to amend the Horizon 2040 Metropolitan Transportation Plan and the Transportation Improvement Program to A, Program New Mexico 404, Environmental Preliminary Design and Final Design Funds, CNE 100200 for Super 2, 1 lane each direction with center passing lanes, and 4-lane widening with limits from I-10 to New Mexico 213 and New Mexico 404 I-10 bridge replacement project for $800,000 of border state infrastructure funds in fiscal year 2018 MPOID number M643X, and for $980,000 of border state infrastructure funds in fiscal year 2019 MPOID number M644X. Item number B is to program New Mexico 273 Master Drainage Study Project, MPOID number M642X, CNE 100310 from Texas State Line to milepost 9.2 to add $1,600,000 of border state infrastructure funds in fiscal year 2018.
Good morning again, Greg McNichol with the chairman of the TPAC committee. This again is a pretty straightforward amendment that New Mexico's requesting. We reviewed it and recommend it to you for approval.
Members have any questions on this? Sorry, we had a motion to approve from Dr. No. We have a second, Representative Sparks. Is there any further discussion on this item? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstaining? Motion carries.
Item number 4, discussion action to approve recommendations from the Transportation Project Advisory Committee to approve the Destino 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan Draft Financially Constrained Project List.
Do you want the public hearing first?
It would be
Yeah. Greg McNichol again. First, I want to just acknowledge this. This plan has been a very active and required a lot of time. And I want to first personally thank all the membership of the TPAC. I mean, we had multiple special meetings and even work sessions to work through this. Very productive meetings and a lot of back and forth, to be honest with you. Trying to get everything to be physically constrained. A lot of help from everybody. And so I thought it was a interesting project. I've done these in the past. This one was more engaged than I've seen in recent years. So this is good. I think this is real good. Speaks well to our community that we're actively working on trying to find solutions to everything. So I think anyway, the project list that you have in front of you was the one that we looked at in early December and approved at that time, and recommend it to y'all for consideration.
Before I open up for any questions, I didn't want to echo your comments. I think I know there was a lot of dynamic conversation going on from all entities involved, and this is always a complex process, but the engagement was good, and we got everybody to get onto the same page, which is always a positive way to begin this process and place it out for comments. So
And I agree with you. And dynamic, as you said, our conversation is just good. We're all concerned about our community, and that's the way it was presented and the way it was all about all the time. And so it was very professional. And so healthy debate is always good. Is the way I look at it. That's but it was just that, and compromises were found.
well, and with that being said, were there any questions? Yes.
So
Mr.
what we're
Benajic.
approving today is just the draft of this plan that goes to the public.
Correct. That's the action we're taking today.
And then this plan may be altered or changed or remain the same depending on how the public meetings go, is that correct?
Right, so what this does is it affords the MPO to start fully engaging the development of the modeling. From there, we'll implement we'll actually include the roadway projects, including the transit projects. From there, we submit the roadway networks, as we call them, or the model, to TTI for the air quality analysis. Then we assemble all 3 documents, the long-range plan, the short-range plan, and the conformity determination. And then from there, we launch a 30-day public comment period. At the end of that public comment period, we come back to the policy board and inform the board of any comments related to the plan. And again, this plan is active. The action that is being asked for today is simply the draft project list.
So then TPAC will eventually get this back, go over it, and recommend a final plan to us sometime in April.
Yes, sir. There'll be a set of public meetings. From there, we would engage TPAC for a recommendation to have the policy board approve this plan as a whole.
Mike, do you have that calendar on the public meetings? Have we set that?
I think we were looking at March, is that right?
Starts March 9th, 30 days.
March 9th is the start of the 30 days.
Okay, so,
So I guess let me describe that. So what we do is that we will post on our website the initiation of the 30 days. Along with that, we send out information to contact lists, to all the boards, to all the agencies that were involved. And then we also utilize the newspaper or any other media outlet for that distribution of that plan.
okay. So everybody's clear, you want to engage folks that you represent in this process. That's the way to do it. So keep an eye out for that in March, right?
Yes, sir, March 9th.
Right. Was there, no? Were there any other questions or comments? No? Do I have a motion? Oh, do we have public comment on this item? I'm sorry.
Yes.
We do have public comment, but we can take it after you motion or before. It's up to you.
We'll just take it now.
Ms. Hilda Villegas?
Good morning. My name is Hilda Villegas. I'm from Familias Unidas de Chamizal Association. I've been here before. I've spoken on behalf of my community, and we've expressed greatly the concerns that we have due to traffic issues in our community, due to the proximity to the international port of entry. I do see that 2045, we did participate in those meetings, and we did express that concern, and we also expressed the concern of the streets that needed improvements so that we could have our residents be able to commute easily. We are a community that greatly depends on public transportation as well as walking. We don't have a large population of people using vehicles. So with this said, we do experience a lot of contamination due to commercial trucks idling Paisano, and we also experience a lot of businesses, local businesses within our communities that do not respect the residential aspect of our community. We are seeking to see if it's possible within that plan that there is also an effort to reroute those trucks and away from our main streets that are residential. We have Eucaliptos, Piedras, that we have 2 of our elementaries there, and that those trucks do go through our communities. And it's not just the trucks that go to Juarez. We do have a lot of trucks that are U.S. Business that are locally within warehouses. And with that said, we do feel that the only solution would be for a reroute of those trucks that do have to do with transportation. We also see that there is an issue with other projects being proposed within our community that do have to do with transportation. And we feel that like the PISD that's trying to build a transportation facility in our community, yet they feel that they don't have to abide by any of the transportation or environmental requirements that are either state or federal. And we do see that that's going to create more traffic in our community, which is bringing close to 400 employees plus buses that do commute students back and forth to the schools. I don't know if this is related to the 2045, but I do see that there's items that do address traffic. There is money being allocated to be able to reroute or to control these issues. And like this woman that was speaking before in the training, that she was talking about Title VI and about civil rights. We do feel that what we're experiencing is an issue of civil rights violation and environmental. discrimination. We are a group that is protected. It's a protected group. The majority of the kids, majority of the people that are being affected are children, are minorities, and the women and the elderly. We do have a public
Ms.
transportation.
Villegas, I'm sorry, you're 3 minutes.
Yes. The Sun Metro, they travel through Paisano and they're not allowed to stop because of the truck traffic concerns. So with this said, I do feel that there has to be more done to deal with these issues within the transportation, community or groups or any agencies that do deal with these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other public comment?
No, sir.
No?
No additional public comment.
No. Okay, we have a motion.
Move to approve.
Okay, motion, okay. Motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstaining? Motion prevails.
Next, we have report, item number 5, the annual listing of the obligated projects for fiscal year 2017.
Raquel Lopez, El Paso MPO. The fiscal year 2017 annual listing report of obligated projects lists transportation projects in the El Paso Metropolitan Planning Organization area that had funds obligated in fiscal year 2017. The listing includes projects that were in the fiscal year 2017 of the El Paso MPO Transportation Improvement Program and were subsequently listed in the statewide Transportation Improvement Program. Some of the projects in this listing were grouped, therefore were not listed individually in the program, but were led by the state and covered in the STIP. So we divided the projects, the categories between bicycle and pedestrian, non-group highway projects, group highway projects, highway, Sun Metro for the city of El Paso, and elderly and other mass transit projects. Do you have any questions?
Members have any questions?
And this document is also posted at the El Paso Metropolitan Planning Organization website, as required before December 31st of the present year. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I may just add, is that
Yes.
this is a federal requirement that the MPO is executing here. So we send out this communication to both DOTs to ensure that the MPO is complying with the federal requirement.
Thank you very much.
Next, we have report item number 6, and that's the reconciliation of federal funds for fiscal year 2018.
Good morning, Roger Williams with the El Paso MPO. At the last policy board meeting, a policy was passed on for the reconciliation of federal funds, and to bring this back to the policy board and to have a recommendation moving forward on how to, or an approval on projects moving forward on how to utilize these funds. So what we've done here is it just brought back to you the reconciliation so that at the next meeting we would be bringing back actual projects. We've notified through the TPAC the members that to begin to prepare your project request forms and bring them back to us, and we gave them these numbers with a few minor changes. I'd like to point out, and you have this table in your packet, it is 5 funding categories here, starting with CMAQ. As you move across the table and look, there's a few things there of interest that you need to be aware of. First of all, you see 17 and 18, 2017 and 2018. 2018 is reconciled using 2017 rollover. So you can see that the 2017 now has been moved into 2018. Other things impact the balance. For example, there's a federal obligation limitation that hits us every year at the end of the year. What that means is that at the beginning of the allocation for each year, we're given a number. And the federal government comes back later and says, well, that number has been altered. We always get some sort of change. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. Okay, so the obligation limitation amounts you can see here in these tables, and when you look over at the last two columns, you'll see MPO balance and total available balance. The difference there is obligation limitation. Okay, so a few years ago, we had to kind of start planning for this because it would hit us at the end of the year, and if you don't have the money and you haven't saved the money, it impacts your current balance in that year. And if you don't have money there, it might impact another funding category. So historically, we went back and looked at what the numbers were, and we started applying every year obligation limitation so that we basically banked that money and saved it for when the actual obligation or when the reconciliation happened. So what we normally work with now, if you look at 2018, we have two numbers, the MPO balance. That's the number that the MPO would recommend that we program. The total available balance is saving for next year, so that when we get to next year, hopefully we have money. That obligation limitation, if it's an impact to us and it negatively impacts our balance, then we have the money saved. So that applies through all of these CMAQ, SDP, the TAP funds, the CBI, and there's one down at the bottom which has got a little bit of money, and that's actually money we got from previous reconciliations into our balance, and that's 12 STP. So all of them have this. The difference in one table is that the Category 7 money has another element there, and it's the PE policy. This is a policy that was passed by the policy board a few years ago, and it allows the smaller municipalities, and when I say that, what I'm talking about is everybody except for TxDOT, City of El Paso, and the County of El Paso, have an opportunity to use that PE policy in Category 7 STP. So that's to help the small municipalities begin the development of projects that they can utilize federal funds, and we save money for them to use that. Now, what's important here at this point, and I'll point it out again, have done that at the TPAC, is that it has to be used by the February STIP revisions. It's the same time frame as we're talking about for reconciliation. In other words, what we're doing here is giving you this information. In January, we'll come back and we'll have projects, potentially. And then in February, we'll take the approvals from the policy board and submit them into the February STIP revisions. So the PE policy has to be utilized by then. By then, it's we're halfway through the fiscal year, basically, and the reason we did it with that milestone is because if we keep going further down the road, it begins to get difficult to program funds, okay? So anybody out there that needs PE funds from those municipalities should be looking at that as well, okay? Now let me go through the balances. The MPO recommendation for funds for 2018 is $5.4 million. Now, that means really that if you have, going back to the policy, if your project's in the TIP or the MTP and it's able to be let within this time frame, then you may accelerate one of your projects into 2018 and use this money. But you have to be careful because it has to fit within that balance. If your project's more than that, well, you're freeing up money over here, but if it's a bigger project, you bring it over here, that money that's out there in 19 or 20 or wherever it's at is not coming back over here. This is the balance you have to work with, okay? Now, there's other things that could be done. Certainly, I know we've talked about that. But if for all practical purposes, this money is in 18 and we're looking for projects that can come into 18 and use these funds. And we'll get that, your project, move it into 18, accelerate it, and then move it through the process, okay? Same thing with the STP. There's the MPO balance. It takes, the difference there is obligation limitation and the PE policy. So if nobody takes us up on the PE policy in February, it's also available, okay? So then you got the, let me go back up to CMAQ first before I go any further. You have to have a CMAQ analysis. So if you have a project that's already got that analysis, then you're in good shape. If you're bringing something in from, say, out in the MTP and it doesn't have a CMAQ analysis, you have a very short period of time to do that. We need to have a CMAQ analysis moving forward, knowing that that project can have a benefit for air quality. STP is the most flexible of all the funding categories, so there's less restrictions there. Category 9, the third. We'll talk about this one a little bit in that it has its own competitive process. You just approved a list of projects that were submitted through Call for Projects. There's 9 of them there. And next month, we'll be coming back with a recommendation on which projects can get funded. Well, you can see there's very little money there, okay? So those, though, have gone through the competitive process. So if you pull another project from out here in the MTP and say, I want to use TAP, well, that's going to be difficult to do. It hasn't gone through that competitive process. The other thing I'd like to point out here is that the MPO balance is $453,000. Before, when we had not had reconciliation back in the summer when we had the call for projects, we estimated at that time about 1.7 million that was going to be available. But you never know until reconciliation actually happens. This year in TAP, and just to let you know, we get annually about 1.4 million. The reconciliation was 1,389,000. It impacted us in the negative. It just wiped us out. If we hadn't had money to roll over, there wouldn't be anything there. So there's only 453,000 and some change left over MPO balance that is available for that call. So there's a lot more projects that were submitted than that. Then the CBI, the next one, is Coordinated Border Infrastructure Funds, and there's another process for this one. You have to have an application, or you might have a project that's already got CBI funds on it, or if you're trying to get a new project in here, the application has to be submitted through TxDOT, and they, on your behalf, will submit that to FHWA, and FHWA has to find your project eligible, and then you go through the process of the normal programming and the TIP, STIP, and so on. So that's the restriction there, is that you need to have an application and FHWA find your project to be eligible. And this last one, 12 STP, it's got just a small amount of money. It's been lingering around there, 120,000. It might be good to take that money and combine it with, say, some TAP money or something. Whatever you guys decide to do. But that 120,000 is there, and it's not really something we've been able to program on anything, and the money's been in the balances for several years. So those are the 5 funding categories that are available. This is the amount that you've got through our reconciliation with TxDOT. The numbers are final now. We've worked with the district to get these numbers to this point, and we believe this is what we actually have to work with. Any questions?
Oh, fantastic. Yes, Representative Ortega.
Is there a cap in terms of what you can have on the available balance? Do the feds require that they be under a certain amount in order to be able to carry over?
Yes, ma'am. There is a cap. All the funding categories that we have on the Texas side, you can locate them in the Unified Transportation Program. And the allocation you see there is the cap. That's the top number. And you cannot go over that number, or it impacts not only at the UTP level, but because we take those numbers, bring them directly into our TIP and MTP. So if we go over that balance, then we show that we're not in fiscal constraint. So yes, ma'am, there's a certain amount. Now these numbers right here that you're looking at are what you're going to see in these funding categories for 2018. So that would be your cap. Now what we're trying to do here is, because we're already moving well into the fiscal year, is it's difficult, but we're finding, all the way up to this point, because it takes until November, December timeframe until the state and the feds coordinate what they need to do to get back to the MPOs, and then we go, okay, now there's money there, but what are you going to do with it? Because there's not a lot of time, and that's what we're looking at here. Yes.
So Roger, regarding the TAP funds, because that's related to the item number 2 that we approved today, and obviously that's not enough funding for the majority of the projects, and then certainly not for the way that they were ranked. How is that going to be then allocated?
That's up to the policy board. I can tell you right now that the projects that scored, and I'm just taking the first couple of projects on that list, are way more than what's available here. So you could potentially, if they're eligible, combine other funds with them, but you've only got this amount now for the 2018 call to program on there. But what I would say is that those projects have already gone through a competitive process. So we know that, you know, moving forward, they have met that requirement. Not to say that they wouldn't have to compete with other projects that might be new projects, but.
But at what point then is the policy board going to make that decision? If we approve today in terms of how we're approving the ranking in terms of the actual allocation of this fund, because they have to be spent in fiscal year 18, at what point is it going to be determined what project they're going to?
At the next policy board meeting.
Okay.
So the TPAC will be looking at that in January, coming back with a recommendation in January so that you guys can make your decision, and we'll get that into the February STIP revisions.
Right, I guess if I could expand on that. What's that?
And yeah, it has to be obligated in this fiscal year. The funds for this, ideally, let there in that same time frame. Obligation is key.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna address that. Thank you.
Any other questions? I want to thank you for drilling down into the details here. I know that this can get a little bit technical, but for the entities that are trying to move their projects in the best way possible, it's best, you know, to have that information and to know the nuts and bolts of what you can and can't do. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Next report, we have item number 7, and that is the amended Horizon 2040 Metropolitan Transportation Plan. Oh, we had, sorry.
Sorry.
Of those projects that we approved, the ranking system, could potentially some of the scope of work for some of those projects alter given the availability of funds? So let's say the UTEP one, there's not enough funding. Could the scope of work change so that it could meet the available funding?
The project itself?
Yes.
If it's within, well, it's difficult because it has a competitive process, and the scoring is based on the project that was submitted to us. If it doesn't alter that, I would say yes, but.
But if there's not enough funding, could we make a reconsideration based on the funding availability?
Well, if I could intervene here, is that what I would, look at is probably try to make the project whole. So understanding that there's, a cocktail of funding that Mr. Williams has gone through, is that we can look at items that are eligible under that funding category. So for example, as we know that the UTEP project was the one that ranked highest with relationship to TAP, we could make it whole with any other funding category that it becomes available. So I think that, the practice, could be that the agency, in this case, if it's UTEP, that wants to make that recommendation via TPAC and then come back to the policy board, that's something that could be done. Because I think that, as we move forward in the development of long-range and short-range plans, we need to use every available dollar to ensure that these projects become whole.
The projects themselves, though, just because they're ranked in a certain order, doesn't mean it'll automatically go. They have to accept it. If we can't find additional funds, they could always turn it down and it would go to the next ranked item.
Yes, sir. I mean, there's
And
no
if that one turns it down, it could work its way down until it reaches one of those that it actually has a significant impact on.
Yes, sir. That would be the
Right.
potential practice.
My question is, can you reduce the scope? For example, you have a mile, can you reduce it so save the budget? A mile of work? Because, when you go in and you prepare, you're preparing for, the amount, looking at the funding that is available, and you try to meet that criteria. But when you reduce the amount of funding that now will be available, can you adjust your scope and reduce the quantities, reduce the length of the project? so that, that you can still have an opportunity to do the project, or at least a phase of the project? Can you phase it?
Right, I think that for the most part, because we go through a prescribed process, I'm not aware of, that flexibility in the process. So when we deal with TAP is that we actually send this also to the Federal Highway Administration. They want a list of the projects that were submitted because at the congressional level, they're asking for this. And so if we submit a list and then there's a will of the policy board to examine the reduction of scope, I don't know if there would be a question about it's not the same project anymore. So I think that in relationship to, transparency, is that if I have a project and understanding that it was the #1 ranked project, but I don't have available funding, and if the MPO, meaning the policy board, goes through the identification of any other existing funding and it's still not whole, then the policy board can simply go down the line if it wishes. I just don't know, to be quite honest with you, Mr. Marcus, is that if we were to, reduce the scope, if there would be any other questions.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Bernadette?
Roger, I got a question on for the CBI money, are feasibility studies eligible?
This would be for a construction project within 50 miles of a Texas-Mexico border.
We can send you the.
There may be some PE part that would be, the study would be, we'd have to look into that, but I've never seen anything.
For
that did a study.
feasibility studies would be eligible under CMAQ or STP though, right?
Not CMAQ.
No, not the CMAQ.
Not CMAQ, but STP?
We have made the case for STP in the past.
We can send you the 5 elements of the CBI test. And as Roger mentioned, is that there's a requirement that promotes the mobility between the United States and Mexico.
Sure. I think Mr. Doolittle for this.
Mr. Chair, I just want to clarify, so the change in scope comment has come up twice, so I understand what Mike was saying about the potential for modifying those, but change in scope is going from like sidewalk to a multi-use path or restriping, those types of things. A change in termini is completely different than change in scope. So, we frequently will adjust termini, but not change scope. So I only want to make sure that the board understands that there's a distinguishing difference between those two. That may not change Mike's response, but there is certainly a difference between change in scope and change in termini.
Yes, and I think what would have to happen in that case is, and we have on the TPAC, the committee that actually scored these, we would be looking at, if you came back and changed a project, well, how does that change your ranking? And it may or it may not.
Yeah, I think that's the question. Yes, sir.
And to add to that, if we're gonna walk that trail about, changing scope of work, just to, modify it so that you can, have that project, so you can have that funding, then what's gonna stop everybody from doing it? And then it's gonna change everything. So we already have policies and procedures that already indicate what your project is. So if you're gonna allow one, then you're gonna have to allow it for everybody else. Because in that case, then what's stopping me from doing it if El Paso does it or Anthony does it or anybody else with any projects? What's gonna happen is that it's just gonna delay, all of these projects because we're gonna undo the system that is already there. That's one of the things that we as a policy has to really think about if we're going to go that route. I think that, that's why the rules are there, so that we can abide by those rules.
Yeah, and I think, thank you. I think what we're hearing is that if you're going to engage in that change in the project, we do have a process, and the, TPAC would look at it as, is this a new project being submitted essentially? Does the score not really reflect this project anymore based on the amendments? The entities can change them if they want to. I think that's okay. But I think what they have to know going in, eyes wide open, is that may not be the same project in the eyes of the policymakers, and so the scoring may move their rank down. So there's a risk you run with that. So I think that as long as we are using the same process to put these proposals through, then the score may or may not come out the same, but that's, as long as it's the same process, I think it'll be okay. Yes, sir?
So the criteria and the scoring needs to be adhered to.
Yes, I mean, as long as we're sending it through the same process, then I think we should be,
So the scoring on the criteria should be adhered to?
yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Chairman Pickett.
So is the TPAC, what we approved, as Mike was saying, is the feds want to see that we had qualified projects that met. So we've got a lot more than the money that we have.
Yes, sir.
So we just said, okay, yeah, those all need it, according to TPAC. Now, is TPAC going to come back with a recommendation on spending the 1.7?
Well, it's actually 453,000 now, and that's what they will do, yes, sir.
So what have we got in the 1.7?
We didn't
What
get-
is under the 1.7?
The 1.7 is what we thought we were going to have when we
Right.
had the announcement for the call for projects. That was prior to reconciliation.
Okay.
After getting dinged.
Because
the way we did
your
it.
chart goes right to left in some regards, right? I mean, if we go out to PE, OB limit, project cost, and then back, so you're saying we've got 453,000 for TAP.
Yes, sir.
So we can clear this up right now. That knocks out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,
Unless they come up with a
projects?
different funding stream.
Unless they want to come up, offer, and that hasn't been asked. Could the sponsoring entities up their ante?
They
To
could.
get it to the 453, we've got a $568,000 project in Socorro with zero current, and they don't have to, local participation, but if Socorro said, we're going to come up with $110,000 to sweeten the pot, what is TPAC going to do now? Are they going to communicate with these projects? Because UTEP's out, City of El Paso's out, City of El Paso's out, Socorro's is out. I'm trying to get down to 1, 2, there's only 2 projects, right? That fit the dollar amount.
Yes, sir.
Right.
Oh, hold on.
To go through that process.
I don't know, were you done?
Not quite, but just, are we going to, is TPAC going to communicate, first off, that all these projects the board has blessed? And we thought we had 1.7, we have $453,000. What do you all want to do? Is that going to be asked by TPAC before we make a determination? Because right now, unless there's any other new information that comes forward from these sponsoring entities, there's only 2 projects that could be funded.
That's right. And the TPAC will make a recommendation, and if the TPB wants to provide guidance to us moving to that process, we will take that recommendation into consideration.
Okay.
Monica, did you?
No, I was just saying that's why I brought up the question.
Okay. Representative.
Well, my only point is, in theory, there's only one way down there, but I think we still have to go through the process of allowing rank number 1, number 2 to turn it down, because they do have the opportunity to make up the difference, correct?
They do. They can
Right,
come in
so,
with a
I
local
mean,
contribution.
And so that process needs to move forward pretty quickly.
And I think that's what, because we know we have a February, essentially, we've got to get this in the February step revision, so that's where we're at. So the conversation you're having today is, if you're an entity here that doesn't meet it, and you have a high ranking, then, there are solutions available, we've heard them today, finding other mix of funds that the project qualifies for, upping the local contribution to the project,
But I don't
and
think
then.
that's been made clear. I don't think it's ever been clear in the process. That's why I was asking. Right now, it sounds like TPAC was just going to deliberate between 2 projects.
No, that's not what I understood.
Not
I heard that
necessarily.
they were gonna coordinate with the entities to figure out what can make it,
Right.
what can't make it in time. That's what I heard.
They would be looking at, considering the same things. Can you make a local contribution to make your project whole?
And let me ask one more since we're on this. Does the amount of participation help with your ranking?
No, sir.
None at all?
That's not part of the scoring process.
Okay.
It's not part of TAP.
Yes, ma'am.
So then that goes back to then, and I agree in terms of what Trent was saying, is there's a difference between changing the scope and then just changing in terms of the boundaries of the, and that hasn't been addressed in terms of that, if that's gonna be allowed, because you're not really, you don't wanna lose, we don't wanna lose the funding. So in terms of, say, like, you know, in Utah, say they're just taking, if they decide to just do a portion of the project that they submitted, but not the whole thing, they're not really changing the scope, they're just doing only a portion, and that's what's not been, I don't think that's what's been addressed, is that going to be allowed?
Yeah, we'd have to look at each project individually and then apply all the criteria and come back and see if it did or it didn't.
Mr. Bealey?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. One is just changing the limits of the project will, in some cases, particularly with TAP-type projects, might well change the scope entirely, change the score. The limits on a simple roadway are one thing. On a TAP project, it's totally different. Secondly, you've got to keep in mind that this money has to be obligated by the end of the fiscal year. So the project has got to be a long way down the road. It's got to have all of its environmental clearance, everything else, in order to actually be obligated. So that's something people need to keep in mind. It's not just dealing projects, it's looking at projects that are capable of going. And that's why TPAC is going to have to look at, do you take some STP funds, for example, and combine them because we have a project that's ready to go. So that's what they've got to work through.
But I'm assuming that because what we approved today has already been ranked by TPAC, that they are all ready to go, correct? Because of the fact that it was a call specifically for the 2018 surplus funding. So I'm assuming that when TPAC, or the committee actually, that went through and did the evaluation, that they did take that into consideration already, correct?
Right, that's our understanding,
Yeah.
and I wanted to make sure with Rogers that this call is specifically for construction. So, you know, going back to the eligibility of that federal aid, is that there is a requirement for an environmental document to be cleared.
Representative Ortega?
If criteria is met, is priority based on ranking?
The priority is, the criteria is, that was met, is what's determined your ranking here.
Okay, so it's based on criteria rather than what has already been ranked?
There's criteria that we've developed that is specifically for this, which prioritize these projects now that you see through 1 through 9.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Bealey, you mentioned earlier that if the limits were changed, that it would impact the overall project, and you said it's probably not applicable. Did I hear that correctly, for TPP projects?
I said it might.
It might be.
TAP projects are different because you may have, say, shared use path, you may have some landscaping, you may have some other things. That may not be consistent throughout the length of the project. So if you change the limits, you change that mix and you could change the score. If it's just a roadway, we typically do that with roadways. You can change the limits and everything in between is the same, so it's not a big deal. But in a TAP project, it may or may not be. That's all I'm trying to point out.
I'm still not clear whether or not the procedures, or if there's any current policy that says yes or no, you can change the limits to fit the funding. I would just really like some clarification on that.
I guess from our perspective is that there's no reference to that type of ruling that I'm aware of. But I guess let me just, and I don't need to go into the technical elements of it, but if you have a project that is already environmentally cleared, in this case, if the state DOT has cleared it, it's gone through a NEPA process. And so if the will of the policy board is to come back and allow a section of that project to be built, that's one thing we need to ask. But more importantly is that the remainder of that portion of that project has to be built as well. So, if you want to build a section of it, the entire project has to be there, as I understand the environmental process. There is a federal requirement to do that.
Unlike you could have a situation, for example, if you have a shared use path and you shrink the limits and it doesn't connect anything, is it really a path? Those are the kinds of things.
I think that's why you have the criterion that these projects go through. which, if an entity is going to amend, however you want to define it, terminus or scope, that feeds through the same funnel that these fed through already. And there'll be a determination of whether it has that same impact, whether the score would be the same. And so I think the message from today's meeting is very clear. If you've got an item here that the funds aren't available for, which is the majority of them, there's essentially a short period of time for you to rectify that. Or if you want to look at changing the scope of those projects and see if it still scores as it did in the original scoring, then that's something that needs to be done in short order. So that'd be my message, I guess.
And then also there are other funds here in the reconciliation that may be applied to projects.
That you could,
They're eligible.
like you said, you could look at the mix of funds to be able to get to that total project. Yes, ma'am.
And I'm assuming that that's what TPAC is going to help determine, is if any of those funds would fit projects specifically in this list.
Yes, ma'am. For example, if STP, you would look at that and go, well, for the most part, yeah, that's going to work. You look at CBI, it has very restrictive rules, and CMAQ does too, so it may not. And it may be very hard within the time frame to get those things ironed out to use those funds as well.
But now, the potential does exist that if you identify funding that would be applicable to these projects, we may still have the issue of, let's say the city of El Paso and El Paso County may be eligible for the same type of funding. I'm just using an example. And then is there then going to be, kind of this
They may still come up
tight
short.
spot,
Yeah.
right? Well, if the additional funding would be able to help complete a project, make it whole, and that could be the case with a couple of different agencies, then we're still going to have this. I think that's why, along with the criteria and then the having the rankings help dictate, because even with that additional funding, we still may be in the same position where there's going to be a need for additional funding.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
I guess. All right.
To clarify that, I believe
The ranking would take precedent, though. I mean, if number one could find the funding, even if another one down the list could also, if number one finds the funding, number one would have the opportunity to accept that. Okay.
That would
be a recommendation, but it's still up to the board.
It's up to the policy
Right.
board.
Yes, it would still have to come back here for a vote. So this is not the last time we will have the opportunity to discuss this matter.
Ask Roger a futuristic question.
Just letting you know.
Ask Roger.
Yes, sir.
Okay, for the next round. How can we get the call for projects and the reconciliation closer so that we don't give people all these hopes and we can put a good number out there?
Well, first of all, I'd like to mention that we've already had a call for 17 through 20 for TAP. And then we have money sitting on the table every year, and it's like, well, do we want to have a call for that and we don't have reconciliation done? We don't know that it's actually available. Like this year, we went from 1.7 to 453,000. So until we actually get to the reconciliation, you don't know, and you may end up getting hit in the actual fiscal constraint for your documents.
So some
for
of these
program.
projects, though, could be eligible for the next year TAP.
Right, they've already gone through a competitive process.
So there may be ahead of the game in one respect, but we still don't have enough money. And what are you anticipating in the next fiscal year?
I can get back with you on that, but I don't see that there's a lot of money. Like I said, we already have had a call for all those years in the TIP. So there's small amounts of money laying around out there.
As small as the 453,000?
I think maybe a little bit more than that.
Okay.
Take a look at the balances coming up. But yes, we can tell you that right now. We got the numbers.
And I would caution not to try to get too much of this from the STP funds. I mean, the surface transportation money is important, and TAP was designed, as the old name was designed, for things that we all like and our community wants, but weren't necessarily high transportation priorities.
Correct.
And I'd hate to not build a bridge or redo an intersection or widen Interstate 10 in lieu of some other things. So I know that this STP funds were a little over 6 or close to $7 million, but that in itself is a interchange.
Yeah, it does have a completely different purpose for those funds. Yes, sir. So, next year in TAP, what are we looking at? 342,000 next year, and the following year, 366, and then 20.
But the
Not a little bit
342
more.
is what you're anticipating to be over what's already been set aside.
It's available sitting there right now. Until we reconcile next year at this time, we don't know if that'll be there or not.
Well, you indicated that it would still have to come back to a vote, but then we spent some time talking about that the rules need to be adhered to and the criteria needs to be followed. So just so everyone knows what the game plan is or what the parameters are on any projects that are submitted, it would appear that we already have a good process. We already have the criteria. We need to follow it. We need to grade it accordingly. And if there's additional funding that can be achieved without impacting other projects, but it still shorts the project, I think then going down the list that's already been graded and seeing if whether 1, whether 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 can do it, because I think if you limit the scope, change the scope, it'll change the score. So I think that's what I've heard everyone say. So your comment about it still has to be voted on, I get that, but I thought we were following all the rules and the procedures and process, and that there's been such a focal point by this board on that. I just want to make sure we're clear as a board so that the agencies know what they should be submitting and how they should be submitting it, and it's not going to change at the end because the funding wasn't there. I mean, the funding might get worse in the future. So if we're going to change how we grade based on funding, then we need to look at the whole thing all over again. And I think right now, we have a good process. I think we've gone through a lot of discussions in several months and now probably years in saying how that criteria is important and we need to stick to it. So I would think that that would be how I see it, and that's what I think the majority have been saying, that we need to follow that process. And then the funding part, that's just something that's just going to be an issue in the future regardless of what happens, because the federal government is changing right now and we don't know how much fundings will be available.
Yeah, I don't think there's been any discussion about deviating from those rules or processes or criterion. It's.
I thought I heard that though, whenever you indicated that it still has to be voted on. I thought it was pretty clear.
Well, we do have
Criteria
to
is what
vote.
it
We do have
is.
to vote on TPAC is going to come back with a recommendation based on the funds that are available based on these projects. So that process is still in place.
Yes, sir.
That's
correct. We're not going to change any of the rules. I think what we're looking at
Nothing
is
is
if you change a project,
adjusted.
does it change the ranking?
What I was speaking to was if someone, because the discussion was about changing scope, or terminus, or whatever, if that's the discussion by the entity or coming up with a new mix of funds or whatever, because that's all going to happen at TPAC.
It'll
Before-
change the score.
Before it comes, it could.
Yeah.
The discussion is it could or it could not based on the criterion. The criterion won't change. What I said was send it through the same funnel we sent it through before, and if there's a change in it, we're still going to score it the same way we scored it before based on those criterion. And it'll come back to us by a vote at TPAC based on all those things, and then we will have this discussion to either
Understood.
approve or not approve that.
Understood, and I'm just stating for the record that if the scope is changed, I think the score will change. If
Well,
the-
what
if
I've-
the-
what
if
I've
the
heard-
entity-
what I've- what
if
I've
the
heard
entity comes
from-
in and makes a change to it, it's gonna change the score that they got.
Understood. What I've heard from engineers and our MPO staff unanimously is that it could or it could not.
We'd have to see
Well,
what the
that's
changes
a
are.
very good, safe answer, but I mean, I
I think
think
that's why
the
they
bottom
gave it.
line is, when you change your scope, it's gonna change the score.
Could be.
Just based on what my engineers have briefed me on,
Mhm.
it'll change the score.
Well, I'll wait for that to come back to us.
Chairman, and just to clarify, I only brought that up to distinguish the difference between change in scope and change in termini. I don't think we should allow these to go through that process, because in all honesty, Socorro now could change their scope or termini based on, increase that based on the available funding. And so you would have to go through this process all over again. So I just want to clarify, I am not in support of allowing the change in scope or termini. I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew that there's a very distinct difference between those two. I think we should score, based on the scoring, they should allow each one of those to come up with the funding or on their own or however it may be, but I don't think we should change scope or termini because we're doing this process all over again.
All right, I appreciate your input.
Just to add to that, that's what I was saying. Yes, it could, if we wanted to do that, it'll benefit my city and my projects, you know, but that's not what I'm about. You know, I understand that we all come here trying to look for funding for our projects and stuff, but I mean, if you're gonna do something to benefit you, then we're walking in a rocky road where, you know, we might change them all so that it could benefit our project and move it up or down. You know, we have a good process, and all I'm saying is just leave it as is. And if there's funding issues, then, you know, maybe we can add more funding to the project so we can get it. You know, all I'm saying is just leave it as is because it's a good process. It's a good process. You know, there's no need to change the scope because, like Mr. Gonzalez said, is it will change. You know, for better or for worse. You know, do you want to gamble on that? You know, I think that the process is good and sound. I think we should just keep it and just move on. You know, and if funding's an issue, then I think it would be beneficial for us to take it back and see what we can do to help the project if it's on a funding issue. You know, that's all I'm saying.
All right, thank you all. Go to the next item, please.
Okay,
Next item is report number 8, the Destino 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan Development.
did we do the Horizon 2040 MTP report yet? I think, no, I
Oh,
haven't
I'm
actually
sorry.
done that yet.
Item number 7, amended Horizon 2040 Metropolitan Transportation Plan.
Okay, just to make sure that we distinguish between the two of them, 7 and 8, the amended Horizon 2040 MTP is running parallel with our development of a new long-range transportation plan. So we're talking about the amended plan, our current plan. Right now, we brought in projects to the plan, and finding money for those projects, it required us to go back and redo conformity. So we have been going through this process for the approvals of all 3 documents, the amended Horizon 2040 MTP, the corresponding tip that goes along with that, and a new conformity. The last call we had with Federal Highway and TxDOT concerning this was last week. The first thing I heard from Federal Highway is we're very close. So you can see in the report that was provided to you, there's 4 items here that we've talked about. The one hurdle that it appears that we've gotten over, which is very good, is that they've accepted our fiscal constraint of the plan, and they, being Federal Highway, now have some questions on the difference between what they see on the description of projects in the documents and what is actually in the model. There's not too much going on there, but we're waiting to hear back from them if there's anything that needs to be changed. I know that there's a couple things need to be changed as far as descriptions go. The model's a little bit more difficult, though, when we start talking about that. Not difficult so much, but it has a more of an effect on things. But what we see, and what I'm comparing to, is when we did the conformity for this and we submitted this a few months back, with the conformity gives us the numbers on how we're addressing our budgets for the pollutants that we are in non-attainment for. The changes that we have had to make to the model then have an impact on that. So what we see, though, is that it's insignificant. I can't guarantee you, but it doesn't look that we would have to go back through a process of redoing conformity, is what I'm trying to say. In other words, we're hopeful that we'll hear from Federal Highway in the next week or so, and they'll say, well, we've seen what you've recommended on changes for your description, and yes, we do know that some things changed in the model. How are we going to address that? Well, we hopefully will be able to go back and run the vehicle miles traveled and then compare that to what we did in the conformity and go, and my indication right now, even the worst of the cases, which would be the 2040 network, it's less than a 1% difference. Okay, so that's the good news. I think we're almost there.
Right, and I would just say that this is routine work that the federal partner does, is that the bottom line here is that they're making assurances that they are complying with their federal requirements as well. Because, you know, the bottom line here is that we are a non-attainment area, and we have to follow the process. So if there's a violation of the Clean Air Act, obviously this project or this entire plan is subject to a flaw.
And so just to be clear, all comments that we've received from the federal partners have been responded to?
All comments have, with the exception of last round, there was about 4 comments, and Federal Highway is looking into those to make sure that, and we've already responded to those unofficially back with them to make sure, they're trying to make sure what they're seeing in the model is what we have presented as to what is there. And they are supposed to return back formal comments based on those that they provided already. So I expect when they come back, we'll have to reply back again and say, okay, here's a change in project description for a couple of these things. And if they say, yeah, there is a difference in the model, we've already run, for all practical purposes, those things right now, and we can already say, here's what the difference is. Okay. So when they reply back to us, it should be real quick to go back with them. And how long does that really take? I mean, I'm hopeful that in January that we can resolve all of these things. And then what it takes is for Federal Highway to issue an approval letter, but they have to have a letter from the Environmental Protection Agency that they're satisfied, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the New Mexico Department of Environmental Department, and TxDOT and New Mexico Department of Transportation. So they require all of those guys to say, yeah, we're good, and then they'll issue us a letter. I can't tell you when that'll happen exactly, but that we're to that, very close to that point.
Okay. George, do you have any questions on this item? No? Thank you.
Now we have item number 8, Destino 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan Development.
I'll just go over a couple of things that was talked about when the project list was approved. We kind of really hit on all of these items. Now we have a draft approved fiscally constrained project list. That's a major milestone. It took a lot of work to get to that point, and thank you to everybody who participated in all of those meetings. So we now take that list and we start to develop our conformity for the model. Has to be run to demonstrate the VMT, and we're going to move forward then with submitting the VMT to TTI that does the emissions modeling for us. So before we do that, we're going through and doing quality control work to make sure that we've got everything in the project list in a format that is the way the feds want to see it. It doesn't change anything you guys did. It just basically gets reformatted, and at the same time, and we've already been doing this, we go back and look at to make sure that it's saying the same thing in the model, and then we do our model runs, then we submit it for conformity. We develop the conformity document. We're on a schedule to submit in the 3rd week of January to TTI to do the runs for the emissions. And when we receive those back, and it typically takes a couple of weeks, we finish developing our conformity document. The February meeting of the policy board, you will see there will be a request to begin public involvement, to take out our draft version of the plan, which will include this project list. It'll include all of the analyses and the write-up that is being done by the consultant, Alliance Transportation Group. And it'll also include the TIP document that includes the new TIP years that is required for the new STIP coming up in 2019, and it'll also include the conformity document. So then on March the 9th, we start our public involvement. We do 30 days of public review. We bring it back then, and any questions and comments that need to be addressed come back to the policy board, and we go through the process of getting a recommendation to from the TPAC to the TPB to get approval in April. Then we'll submit And we'll be going through the same process then with the federal agencies for approval of our conformity, the same process we're doing right now with the amendment. So hopefully they will stay on a track of 3 months or so. That's what they're required to do it in 90 days. We do know from experience it usually takes longer than that. But for all practical purposes, the schedule that we have, a very tight schedule that's been presented to you, we are on track right now with getting this project list approved today.
Have any questions? Yes, Representative Gonzalez.
This was kind of talked about in your questioning, so I'm just gonna build on that a little bit more. If during the public process you hear comments about a project and it's not positive, who would then at that point make decisions to make any alterations? Would that be the TPAC? Would that be this body? And what is the likelihood of that changing anything?
Well, in the end, it's the policy board that's going to make the change. If there's a change during public involvement, we bring that comment back, and the TPB tells us how they want to move forward with that. If we take something from that out of the plan, in the plan, move it around, it changes the documentation, it changes what you did in public review, it changes the conformity document, and you would have to revisit the conformity, and you would have to redo your public involvement and bring it back to the policy board if it made a change that was significant enough to what the public saw or to the air quality.
I guess let me add to this, is that we'll look at the comment, and based on the described comment, we come back with a response. During that coordination is that we also communicate with the sponsoring agency. So, usually when we have a comment, they tend not to be fatal in that respect, but ultimately is that if there's a project that is truly controversial, it will come back to the policy board, we will address it, and then from there, the policy board has the authority to make any changes it needs to address that comment accordingly. Now, as Roger mentioned, is that if the policy board feels that there is substantial controversy with that project, we would have to go back and redo the entire planning documents.
Back, focus on the conformity. If a project is deleted or postponed, you would do an internal analysis of what that would do to conformity document, correct?
We would do the internal analyses, we would present that to the consultation partners. The consultation partners in the end could tell us that it's insignificant or not.
Okay, if it's insignificant to the conformity document, my understanding is that that's not going to jeopardize an approval of a TIP or MTP.
Normally, those kind of things are like what we're going through right now after you've already had approval of your documents and gone through the process and submitted it to FHWA, and you're doing some review at the end and you realize there's something insignificant. During the process of public involvement here, it would be up to the policy board, but we would get guidance from FHWA to tell us, you know what, this may require a rerun of your conformity. It may require the public involvement to restart. But
because I don't want to get involved in using the adjective that it's controversial. What if we really, let's pick a project, 122 loses funding and it's in the TIP? That's a function of everyday life.
Right.
And you could make that same decision, though, on a project regardless of funding. We just don't like this one to be done right now. We want to postpone it. That's not necessarily controversial or.
And again, I don't want to get too, I guess, into the weeds with technically, but if what the conformity is looking at is, if you take that project out, is now it's changed your conformity document, and how significant is that? From being a non-attainment area, as we are, It's much more difficult to bring in added capacity or delete added capacity projects than it is if you're in an attainment area.
Correct.
And that's what it really boils down to.
When is the conformity document, I don't know if approved is the correct term, but we have a conformity document that's accepted. When does that happen
First,
versus
the-
an approved TIP or MTP?
The way it works with those three documents is when we come back to the policy board, you approve the TIP, you approve the MTP, you recommend the conformity document to move forward to the federal partners to determine conformity, if it is or not conforming.
Okay, so 1, 2, 3, we approve the TIP, approve the MTP, approve a conformity. Conformity has been approved. After the conformity's been approved, if there's a change to the TIP, is it necessary that we change the conformity document?
That's the question, and there's
Well, I
other
guess-
things, there's one other thing going on there, and it's what you took to the public, and how different is that than what the public saw?
Right, so there is a federal rule that addresses that, Chairman. And so I'm very familiar with that rule. So ultimately is that if you have a conformity determination that has been granted by the joint FHWA and FTA partners, it doesn't, dissolve your plan. It is
That's-
understood.
That's my understanding as well, is if you make changes after the conformity document.
Yes, sir. If we can demonstrate that beyond this policy board, that the financial assumptions were removed by way of legislative or whatever it is, that action is recognized by the federal partners.
Okay.
Mr. Beasley?
Yeah, I was just going to point out that there's a difference between approving this plan, which we have to get approved, and approving subsequent amendments, which we do all the time. It's much simpler to deal with conformity issues, particularly when you're pushing projects back or moving projects around because of subsequent planning in an amendment, as opposed to this first step, just because of the timing issues that we have.
So if I was gonna be a team player and I was against a project in the TIP, I should wait till we get it approved, the MTP approved, the conformity approved, and then bring back a project that I'd like to see postponed?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions?
Even though I knew the answer.
Any other questions? No. Thank you, I appreciate the updates and the communication to the members about where we are in the process. Did we have the consultants available as well for this item, or no?
I don't know, are they still there?
Mr. Allen, are you still on the phone?
Hey, it's Jonathan. I don't think JD is still on the line.
So we
Could you repeat the question, though?
No, I'm just saying, we have our consultants available, they were here. Does anybody have questions specifically for them or for MPO staff on this item?
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
The next meeting of the Transportation Policy Board is scheduled for 9 a.m. on the 26th of January 2018. If training is provided, then training will commence at 8:30, but I will send information out to everyone.
Okay. Do we have?
The next item is the executive session item, and that is item number 9, Executive Director Evaluation and Matters Related to the Executive Director, which can be discussed in executive session if the Policy Board wishes to retire to.
Mr.
Recognize the Vice Chair.
On behalf of the Executive Committee, right now, we don't have anything for discussion on that particular item, so I would motion to postpone indefinitely.
Okay. Have a motion to have a second? Second. Have a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstaining? All right.
The newest members who lead us on Christmas song.
Yeah, before I entertain a motion to adjourn, just want to wish everybody and their families happy holidays, happy New Year. And I will now entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Have a motion, have a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All right. This meeting is adjourned.